You know what's crazy? I spent many years painting landscapes completely backwards. Sure, my paintings looked okay, but they were missing that wow factor. And then I discovered this one technique that changed everything. Instead of starting with painting the skyline or the main features, I now begin with the darkest shadows first. And this might sound counterintuitive, right? But watch what happens when I mark in the dark values and shadows first. It makes painting the rest of the artwork, getting your tonal values correct, your colour mixing, painting the areas in light, it makes it so much easier to paint. And I'm going to teach you how to do this in this painting demonstration, which features some mountains in the South Island of New Zealand. These are a great way of learning how to paint depth and distance because there's lots of shadows and lots of areas of the mountains that are in light. So I'm starting off here by painting the distant shadows. Now, since making this video, as I actually painted this last year at the time of making this video, I actually now start by painting literally my darkest darks first of all, but this way still works. So I'm painting the distant shadows here, which are actually quite a bit lighter than these shadows that I'm painting now in the midground. And I've used a combination of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna to desaturate the blue, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. And I'm marking the paint in here with a number 5 bristle flat brush. Now the general rule with landscape painting is we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, and as landforms recede the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So with this in mind, if we mark in the shadows first, then it's going to make it much easier for us to paint the areas in light afterwards. And that way you can create much more depth and distance in your painting. So if you're having flat looking paintings, then try painting your darks first. You'll find things much easier. So we've painted all the dark values first, which is mainly all the shadows in the mountains, and also there's some shadows in the trees and bushes in the foreground. And that's set up the whole structure of the painting. I'm using Blue Ridge oil paints here, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. And now that these darks are in place, it means that I can start off next with the furthest zone away, which is the sky in this case. And for the sky I used a mix of ultramarine blue with titanium white and just a little bit of phthalo green. So the phthalo green is just going to add a slight green element to the sky here. I'm also painting the sky with these downwards brush marks, and it just adds texture to the sky overall, so just making it look more painterly. Now the next thing to do is to begin painting the mountains here and painting the parts of the rocky faces that are in the full sunlight, and I've actually used the same colours that I've used for the shadows. So again, it's a mix of titanium white with some burnt sienna, which are the dominant colours in the mix, but also a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson. So the value of the colour has got to be lighter than the shadow areas in order for it to stand out. Now value is how light or dark your subject is, and as I said earlier, we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. Then as landforms recede, darks are not as dark and lights are not as light. And actually, when I'm painting, I more think in terms of value rather than the colours that I'm mixing. It's also important to make sure that the colours are the correct chroma for where they are in the painting. So chroma is another word for saturation, or the intensity of the colour. So as these landforms recede into the distance, and especially these mountain landscapes, we're generally dealing with more lower chroma or desaturated colour. This mountain in the midground has lots of tussock grass growing on it, which is a pale, low chroma, straw colour grass that grows in New Zealand. And for this I used a mix of yellow ochre with some ultramarine blue, some titanium white and some alizarin crimson. Now another thing about painting the shadows first is that it's going to make it much easier to get the saturation of the colours correct, and the value is how light or dark your subject is, but it's going to make it much easier to get all those correct. You'll be able to see straight away whether your colour is too saturated or if the value is too dark or too light when you have the colours next to the shadows like they are here in the midground. Now as I work towards the foreground here, I'm starting to paint some of the trees. Now trees are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape, so this is something I always keep in mind. Generally with trees there's often a lot of occlusion shadows, especially when they're growing as stands of trees or forests, but also things like conifer trees naturally have dark coloured foliage, so they're often going to stand out in the landscape. In contrast to that, the grass is usually much lighter in value. So the ground planes of the grass, as said in Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, John Carlson, he said that the ground planes are some of the more lighter values to be found in the landscape. Now some of these rules here about values in the landscape are quite easy to remember, and it's good to keep thinking about those as you're painting. So when I paint, I'm always more thinking in terms of value. Of course the colour mixing is important. Now for the grass, I'm using more saturated colour here in the foreground, but it's important not to go overboard. So I normally add some kind of red to my greens just to help balance it out, because red is opposite to green on the colour wheel. For my general grass mix, I've used yellow ochre with ultramarine blue and some cadmium yellow medium as my base greens. And then I mix in titanium white, and this is going to help to desaturate it and lighten the value. And then I'll always mix in some kind of red, so if it's some greens in the foreground, it could be some cadmium red light, or perhaps I could use some burnt sienna or alizarin crimson. Both colours contain red. I'm also varying up my greens as well, so perhaps adding some more ultramarine blue to make the value darker, perhaps some more yellow ochre to give it some more of those earthy looking greens, and just communicate a variety of vegetation. So I'm still in the blocking in part of the painting here, and this is where I just want to establish the main colours, tones and values, so that it serves as a base to work from, so that once the painting's dry I can then begin the next stage of the painting, which is modelling. So this is where I'm starting to refine zones in the painting and add more detail, and start to bring out those landforms that are in the landscape and give it that more three-dimensional appearance. So I started with the sky and clouds again once they were dry, and just lightened the sky a bit more, and that's allowed the mountain to further stand out. And then adding some details to the mountain itself, such as things like the shadows here, just to further define the shape of the mountains, and then adding areas in light. Now painting in these shadows is really going to help to further define the shape of the mountains. Another thing about painting things like mountains is you either want them more in light or more in shadow, not half and half. So here they're more in light, but these little shadows here are going to help to communicate that three-dimensional form of these hills and mountains. Now, as I said before, we're going to find our lightest lights at the distance, so you'll see that the darks in the distant mountains there are quite a bit lighter than the darks in the foreground that I'm painting here. And of course, as I said, the trees and vegetation are some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape. I'm now focusing on individual zones in the painting, such as the mountain in the background, and this is where I started to paint things such as the remnants of the snow that's on the mountain. So even though the reference photo I used for this was taken in the summer, there was still a little bit of snow left on those mountain peaks, and it's just going to add that little bit of extra detail and interest to the painting overall. Now, I wasn't always able to paint artworks like this. In fact, my paintings really lacked depth. I had no structure to them. I was struggling with colour mixing especially, and my paintings just looked flat, my colours looked garish and oversaturated, and I was really struggling. And one of the things that helped me when I got an art mentor was having a system in place for my paintings. So this starts with thumbnail sketches and a main sketch to design the composition. Then sometimes I'll do a value study where I'm just focusing on the lights and darks in the painting. And then I'd either do a colour study if I was going to do a larger painting, but in general use my main sketch as reference for my main painting, like my blueprint. And what I've done is I've detailed my whole painting process in my free landscape painting blueprint, so it shows you everything that I do from start to finish and gives you the basics of landscape painting. So if you want to take your painting to the next level and you're struggling with creating depth and distance in your painting, you're struggling with composition and colour mixing, then my landscape painting blueprint is for you. As I say, it's totally free. Just click the link below and I'll send it over to you. Now then, back to the painting, and you can really see how those shadows that I've added are really starting to bring out the form of the background mountain here and the mountain in the midground. So this is where our tonal values are really going to help to create depth in the painting overall, also keeping an eye on the saturation of the colours. As you can see in the background mountains, I've used really low chroma colours, mainly mixes of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson, which is perfect for shadows but perfect for painting these rock faces that are in light. Of course, I've used more titanium white and burnt sienna in the mix for the areas that are in the full sunlight, but we're just dealing with low chroma earth colours. I can even mix in things like yellow ochre as well for some of those more golden and yellow tones in the background. So we're just slowly dialing up the saturation of the colour as we move forward into the painting, and then when we start painting things like the grass and these trees here, we can go a little more saturated with our greens. Now greens are a colour that a lot of artists have problems with and find it tricky, and I've made quite a few YouTube videos on painting greens, so check those out. What I'm doing now is I'm working on this vegetation that's in the foreground, and I'm just restating the darks here. So if you remember, we'll find our darkest darks in the foreground. So the shadows here are going to be pretty dark. And I've mainly used combinations of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. And this is a good mix for painting foliage because the yellow ochre helps to desaturate the blue, but you can also create some really dark greens with it that aren't high in chroma or saturation. So perfect for some of these shadows in the foreground. Overall with my paintings, I like to keep my brushwork relatively loose. I don't like going overly detailed, as I think it causes the painting to lose its vitality and energy. So I do like a bit of looseness. So more I'm painting the suggestion of things like vegetation and some of the rocks and boulders that are strewn across the foreground here, just to communicate that rugged mountain landscape. Now, one of the things I do last in my painting is I save my lightest values until the end of the painting. So this is really what's going to make it pop. And the lightest values in this case, the snow at the top of the mountain here. So I painted some snow underneath and made the value of the snow a little bit darker by adding in ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and a little alizarin crimson. But then for the snow highlights, I just used titanium white with just a dash of yellow ochre to warm it up a little bit. And those snow highlights are really making that mountain pop. One of the last things I did was I just lightened the sky a little bit around the mountain. I just felt it was a little bit too dark. And I'm applying the paint here with vertical brush marks. It just adds some texture and interest to the sky as well, especially as there's no clouds there. So it's a nice effect that you can do in paintings. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting mountain landscapes, then check out this video here. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.